So I've been ripping on Dragon Ball Super since pretty much episode 1, and I've become fairly notorious for this. One thing that comes up almost constantly within my reviews is the animation quality. More often than not, I'll talk about just how subpar the animation is overall, using terms like off-model, bland shot composition, sluggish fight scenes, bad choreography. And it's come to my attention that when I say all these things, people have no clue what the fuck I'm talking about. And I've had more than a few people now tell me, hey, can you do like an animation breakdown? Point out this bad animation because I'm just not seeing it. So it's time for me to finally just kind of buckle and cave under that pressure and finally pick apart the animation of Dragon Ball Super and get to the heart of what I'm talking about. And for the record, when I talk about like how subpar the animation is for Dragon Ball Super, I'm not comparing this to Studio Madhouse or Studio Bones, or Kyoto Animation, like the top tier, gorgeous animation studios of Japan currently. I'm comparing Toei Animation to Toei Animation, specifically the work that they did 20 years ago on the exact same fucking franchise. So every comparison I make within this video will be to the earlier shows in the franchise, specifically DBZ because that's the one that has the most iconography. And it's a show that this series is clearly riding the coattails of. Now I'm going to kick this off with the easiest of these things to explain, that is off-model animation. What I mean by off-model animation is just when the characters are literally off the model. The model is how the character is supposed to look from like every angle. Like this is how this character looks from this perspective, and this perspective, and this perspective, and from front on, and from the side, and from above, and from below. They have like a model sheet for how these characters are supposed to look at these angles. And off-model is just when they don't look right. Maybe like the nose is askew, or the eyes aren't centered, or maybe the eyes are too small or too large, or it's just sloppily drawn. There are plenty of examples throughout Dragon Ball Super like this. Sometimes it's an entire episode, sometimes it's just a few scenes within a really well animated or well drawn episode. But it's something that comes up almost every single episode. You'll find at least 1 or 2 scenes, usually 2 to 4 scenes I would say, where it's just, oh, that character wasn't drawn quite right. But then the rest of the episode will look fine. But it is something that I always bring up where every so often, oh, there's a little bit of off-model animation. And it's something for me personally that kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, especially after having watched this franchise for so long, and I know what these characters are supposed to look like. And then when the animators just completely fucking drop the ball, it's really goddamn noticeable. Next I'm going to tackle the piss-poor fight scenes that happen quite frequently within this series. And my Exhibit A for this is one that a lot of people seem to really like, but I thought was fucking atrocious, and that is Beerus versus Vegeta in the Beerus arc, where Vegeta has his big My Bulma scene, and he lashes out at Beerus. I thought the scene was absolute garbage, and I'm just gonna break it all down for why I think this whole sequence is fucking terrible. First off, we have a power-up sequence that conveys no sense of power. It's just Vegeta standing completely still with his swirling energy around him. It might as well be a fucking GIF just spinning around him. And then to convey him dashing across the screen in high speed, they take a single drawing of Vegeta and then slowly enlarge it to give this sense that he's moving towards the camera. Once again, slowly I might add, slightly shaking the camera, and then only changing to a different frame of animation until he gets really, really close to the camera. Go back and rewatch that scene. Vegeta going from a standing position to flying towards Beerus is 2 frames of animation up until he is right up to the camera. It looks cheap, it looks lazy, it looks goddamn terrible. Now let's compare this to a very similar scene in Dragon Ball Z where Vegeta is doing a very violent power-up leading into a full-on dash towards the camera. Here we see it, the frame is violently shaking, lights flashing, dirt and rocks are being kicked up, he's affecting the area around him, conveying the mass amount of power he's putting off. And then whenever he dashes towards the camera, it's a completely different frame of animation each time, and the camera pans with him to help convey the speed that he's moving at. Very similar concepts, way different execution. NZ had the much better execution. Now let's talk about flat shot composition using the exact same fight scene that we were looking at before. After Vegeta darts across the screen, we then see from a flat side angle Vegeta coming on screen, slowly I might add, clashing with Beerus and then rapidly punching him in succession, which of course Beerus blocks with ease. And of course when Beerus hits him back, Vegeta does this ridiculous spin, And to convey the force of just how hard Vegeta was hit, it's once again a single frame of Vegeta that they're just spinning around in a circle. Once again, highlighting just how cheap the animation is here. And like last time, I'm just going to go ahead and juxtapose this scene with the same fight scene from Vegeta and Raccoon from DBZ. Once again, a really similar concept, Vegeta dashing towards an opponent that he's completely outmatched by, releasing a flurry of blows until he gets nailed down by his opponent. Except here, it's done with a lot more artistic flair. Vegeta is shown dashing towards Raccoon from multiple angles. When he first clashes with Raccoon, there's a real sense of weight to his punch, and his flurry of blows is more visually impressive overall. And the sad thing is that it's not even necessarily a more expensive scene to animate, at least in terms of the actual combat. One of the cost-cutting techniques that DBZ did a lot of was drawing characters doing multiple attacks and strikes and blocks within a single frame of animation to give the action sequences a more high-speed, intense vibe to them, which is a technique that Dragon Ball Super has apparently completely forgotten about. The next topic I'm going to tackle is one that has less to do with animation specifically, and one that's a bit more subjective and really hard to convey. And that is just the basic pace of a fight scene. And there's really no better example of like a horribly paced fight scene than the Goku versus Frieza fight in Dragon Ball Super. The beginning of this fight is easily one of the lamest, most weak sauce attempts at creating tension at the beginning of a fight I've ever seen. It opens with Goku and Frieza exchanging a couple of weak blows. One admittedly does create some damage to the surrounding area, which is kind of visually impressive, but then that immediately leads into them having a long, drawn-out grapple match where they're just kind of powering up against one another, and this goes on for an incredibly long amount of time. Now, some might argue that, well, it's the beginning of the fight, it's the warm-up, of course it's going to have a slower start to it. And yes, of course, there needs to be build-up at the beginning of a fight. You can't just jump in running on all cylinders. So my go-to example for how to do this correctly is the Goku vs. Frieza fight from Dragon Ball Z. The fight begins with Goku dashing towards the camera, pulling his fist back and landing a massive punch that Frieza blocks, creating a giant shockwave. Then the two disappear. The next scene is a cost-cutting measure, but a stylish and effective one. We get quick flashes of the two exchanging blows, with booming sound effects to convey the force with which they're striking with. Next we move on to another cost-cutting measure, where we see the camera is darting back and forth over a vacant planet Namek, with the sound effects of Goku and Frieza clashing, which reinforces the idea that the characters are moving too fast to be seen, even by Gohan and Kuririn. After that is a slow, panning shot over an empty landscape, except this time we see small glimpses of the two fighters, and the massive amount of destruction that they're causing to the planet each time they collide with one another. And finally, this leads us to us seeing our hero and villain battling it out for real. Now, the beginning of their fight in DBZ is not only a much cheaper solution to creating a slow build-up to a fight, but also one that's more just effective overall, because it's actually a build-up. We get little flashes, little teases of what's to come, whether it be in just small striking panels, or just hearing the sound effects of them clashing, or just seeing the devastation that they're doing to the landscape around them. It all helps building an anticipation for seeing the actual fight that's about to happen. And it also goes to prove that low budget doesn't necessarily mean a worse product. There's obviously more effort and animation put into the Super version of that fight, but it was sloppily directed and conveyed no tension, resulting in just a worse product overall. And in case you think I'm cheating by pulling some of like the best animated scenes from Dragon Ball Z, well then just look at some of like the worst looking episodes of the series. It's not about animation or art quality here, it's really just about the direction, how to frame and compose a shot, how to pace a fight scene, how to build tension. Even the worst looking episodes of DBZ understood these basic fundamentals and knew how to use its budget accordingly. And finally, the last thing I want to bring up is something that's a bit vaguer and even harder to try to convey to people, and that is atmosphere. And I feel there's no better scene in Dragon Ball Super to compare to Dragon Ball Z than one that they directly recreated from Dragon Ball Z, and that is the whole Gohan death scene, Trunks becoming a Super Saiyan for the first time in his future timeline. Well, let me just say, as far as Dragon Ball Super goes, this is a finely made scene. It's not, bad at all, and I'm pretty sure if people had seen this and don't really remember the Trunks special that well, they're probably thinking I'm being an asshole right now. And like I said, it's fine by Dragon Ball Super standards, but whenever you think back to what the original scene was and how well it was executed, you kind of start seeing where my gripes begin. I feel there's no better way to convey this other than just show you both scenes at the same time. And yeah, I made a few little edits so that way they sync up a bit better, but you get the idea. This isn't about pacing, this is once again is about the atmosphere. And where DBZ completely slaughters this is just like its use of composition of shots, and the big thing here is just shadows and lighting. It uses those to great effect in DBZ, and in Super they're pretty much non-existent. Super at least kind of goes for some muted colors. It doesn't have the washed out color palette that the original did. It doesn't use lighting and shadows to increase the atmosphere, to create that sense of hopelessness and sorrow that the original Trunks special had. Taken on its own merits, it's a fine scene, but the Super version is just flat when you compare it to what was done in the Trunks special. And once again, like, the Trunks special wasn't even like a top tier animated thing. There are scenes in the Trunks special that look like shit, but where they really nailed it was this sequence. And where Super really just dropped the ball was the sequence. Like I said, by Dragon Ball Super standards, it's fine. But when you compare it to what came before it, that's where everything starts falling apart. And really that has been my biggest criticism of Dragon Ball Super as a whole. When you compare it to what came before, it all just kind of falls apart. And this isn't nostalgia, or being a fanboy, or any of that bullshit. This is just me breaking down these elements and trying to convey to people, this is what I'm talking about, this is why I'm disappointed. This is why Super isn't visually holding up. Now, that's not to say that Super just completely failed all around. I mean, there have been plenty of episodes that look really great, that have great action sequences, and those moments are great, but they're also few and far between. Right now, Super's highest highs is about where DBZ would land on its average. It never hits the high points that Z does, and its lowest lows are way below what the franchise has ever been at before. So that wraps up everything I had to say. Hopefully you guys got where I'm coming from, what I've been talking about in all these goddamn reviews. Until next time, Zeon, out.